We are back now with some news to bring you involving that Russian lawyer who was a part of the now infamous Trump Tower meeting back in the summer of 2016. NBC News investigations reporter Tom Winter is with us now on the phone. And Tom, she has now been charged with obstruction?
That's correct, Hallie. She's been charged with obstruction of justice. We should point out that this case in this charge today is not at all related to the kind of now infamous Trump Tower meeting, but is instead related to her representation of Prevezon Holdings. And this is a large civil forfeiture case, and frankly, it goes back several years, involving hundreds of millions of dollars of tax fraud in a case that was brought by prosecutors here in New York, not in a criminal sense, but in a civil sense, seeking to get some of the proceeds back, and it's also tied to money laundering. What's interesting today, Hallie, is that the indictment kind of lays out just how tied into senior Russian government officials Natalia Veselnitskaya is. In the past, she has kind of represented herself as somebody who didn't really have those type of connections. In the past, other folks that were involved with that meeting had asserted that she wasn't really that deeply connected to the Russian government. And now you have federal prosecutors in New York in a criminal proceeding saying not so fast, that she has deep ties, and that the obstruction of justice charge that she is now faces and has been indicted for is directly tied to her work in actually fabricating or coming up with exculpatory documents, basically documents that were to show that Prevezon wasn't involved in the illegal conduct that they were alleged to have done. It now appears that Veselnitskaya, according to this indictment, was involved with fabricating or kind of making up those documents as they presented them to authorities here in the U.S.
And Tom, I don't want to glide over something critical that you said at the very beginning of this conversation, which was an emphasis on this is different. This doesn't have to do with her involvement in that meeting, a meeting that has obviously been critical to this whole discussion of Russian interference in the election. But this is separate, right? I just want you to underscore that point.
Yeah, it's completely separate. If you're looking for the name Donald Trump Jr. or any of the other people that were associated with this meeting, or Paul Manafort or anything like that, you're not going to see it. This is an entirely separate case, and it does not appear on the surface, although I do need to read a little bit further into the indictment. We just got the notice from the Justice Department in the last several seconds here, so I don't see on the surface any direct references to that meeting, but I do think her ties to the senior Russian government officials, I think the fact that it's underscored in this is something that bears further scrutiny. Let's put it that way.
Tom Winter, we have MSNBC legal analyst Danny Cevallos also joining us on the phone as we take a look at these three photos that we have of Veselnitskaya. That's who she is right there. Danny, can you talk through what happens for her next?
It depends if she's charged by indictment. She's likely going to turn herself in. I'm not aware if she's presently in the United States or how that's been worked out. Again, we're just getting this information moments ago, so I'm not certain what her status is, where she's located. And then from there, depending on, and in fact, I believe it's an indictment. It is not an information which would tell us that possibly she was cooperating. It's an indictment by the grand jury. So that tells us that that a grand jury found probable cause that she gave false statements or contributed to false statements being given, which don't necessarily have to do with the criminal investigation or any criminal investigation. They can apply to a civil proceeding too. The scope of the false statements and obstruction of justice statutes is very, very broad. Although there are several different statutes, about 7, that cover the conduct, they are very broad and far-reaching.
Hey, Tom, do I still have you on the phone? Tom Winter?
Do.
Great. As we talk about this, so listen, you've explained and Danny has laid out what this means for this particular woman, Veselnitskaya. Can you bring us up to speed on the Mueller investigation, where the special counsel investigation stands now? There had been some reporting from NBC News that perhaps as early as next month, we may see some movement here. What is your understanding of the latest on that front?
Well, I think the reporting from my colleagues, Ken Delaney and Pete Williams, they're reporting that the Mueller report could come as soon as the middle of February. I could tell you, Hallie, my understanding is that they've been working on this final report for at least several months now. I think 6 months is a safe bet. And so I think that, yes, I think there's a lot of, while we may find out certain things and we may start to go, down into these kind of rabbit holes of the investigation as reporters, as people talking about the case, it's safe to assume that they're much further along than we know, and that they have presumably run down leads that we're just hearing about. So I think my understanding of it is that we are definitely closer to the end than the beginning. That's for sure. As it relates to this, NBC News was the first to report, myself and my colleague Julia Ainsley, that the president's response to this Trump Tower meeting, of which this person, Natalia Veselnitskaya, was involved with, that his response to that and how that all kind of came together on an Air Force One flight back from Saudi Arabia, and kind of a succession of statements that you reported on the time, Hallie, as far as kind of explaining this meeting, that's something that was being looked at by the special counsel. Now, whether or not that turns out to be something that is included in any final report or any future legal proceeding, time will surely tell. But I do think that it's interesting that this issue, the Prevezon issue, which had been largely resolved on the civil side of things, apparently kept going on the criminal side of things. It indicates to me that prosecutors in New York wanted to continue their investigative efforts, and federal agents in New York wanted to continue their investigative even after they were able to get a settlement in this case and able to get money returned. So it's interesting to me that they continue to follow up on it. We'll have to see whether or not any of this came out of the Mueller investigation. Obviously, we know of several cases brought in New York that are tied to that. I mean, you look at the Michael Cohen case as a case that was spun off from the Mueller investigation. So when you start to look at this, it'd be interesting to see if there's a bigger picture to this, or it's simply just kind of cleaning up the rest of the investigation from what happened with Prevezon and Veselnitskaya's involvement here in the first place.
Danny, let me go to you on this Natalia Veselnitskaya news that we've been getting. She sat down, I don't know if you remember, we played it on this network and over on NBC with my colleague Keir Simmons. I think it was last summer in this exclusive interview, and she said she didn't have any connections with the Kremlin. Is what we are seeing now in this new charge, does that directly contradict what Veselnitskaya has said?
It tends to contradict, and it's important in looking at these charges that we understand that the federal government was engaged in a process of what's called civil forfeiture. It's basically a civil case where the government goes after a defendant and says, hey, you committed these money laundering activities, and we're going to take your stuff as a result. In the case of drug dealers, it can be a speedboat that they use. In the case of a large company, it can be other kinds of property. And that's exactly what the government was doing. And it's interesting that normally in the context of the Mueller investigation, most of the defendants charged with false statements were folks that the FBI visited and they sat down with, and that person tried to talk their way out of trouble, and bang, they get hit with Section 1001 or other false statements or obstruction of justice charges. And what you see here is the wide scope of the statutes, which allow for the same charges, not just in a sit-down verbal interview, but in fact a written submission that someone might make or even contributed to. And that's how they hung the jurisdictional hook on Veselnitskaya.
And Tom, does this then lay to rest any pretense that Veselnitskaya doesn't have connection to the Russians?
I'm sorry, Hallie. Just hang on one quick second, because there's a little bit of an indication that I have that actually today's indictment may relate to a story that Richard Engel, our own colleague, did last year about emails showing how that she was involved in drafting responses to the inquiry. So this is something that it appears that our colleague Richard Engel actually first kind of keyed in on in one of his stories. He's reported extensively about Veselnitskaya and about kind of the more the Russian component to this. I've been a little bit more focused on the New York City investigation and the New York prosecutors' action, but we're starting to get a sense that that some of this was kind of first referenced in Richard Engel's reporting just a according to some information that we're getting. I wanted to go back to your original question, and if you could repeat it, was just a little tough to hear. I'd be happy to answer it.
Well, it was just about essentially, and very quickly here, Tom, and we're going to, by the way, get Richard Engel in front of a camera any second. He is scrambling to do that, so stand by for that. But Tom, just very quickly, Veselnitskaya has no leg to stand on when she says, I have no connection with Russians based on what we are now seeing from this charge. Is that fair to say?
I would say so. Based on our preliminary read of the indictment documents today and the information that's being presented by the U.S. attorneys here today, she definitely appears to have those ties.
I appreciate your caution and your smart reporting and your live analysis as you are reading the documents here with us on the air. Tom Winter, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank Danny Savalos. I want to thank A.B. Stoddard. I want to thank Tamara Keith as well. We are out of time after what has been a jam-packed 60 minutes. Craig Melvin, I hand it over to you gladly, my friend.
All right. Hallie Jackson, thank you so much.
Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel. Why don't you subscribe? It's really easy. Just click on that button down there. And for more news from MSNBC, click on any of these videos here for the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more videos from MSNBC with our newsletters. Head over to msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up.